Anim Zmiros, I shall sing sweet songs. That's Eitan Katz from his album Live in Jerusalem. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Were you able to tune in last night when we had our Eitan Katz Kumsitz in the living room in Marina Del Rey, hosted by Avi Meir, Mr. and Mrs. Avi Meir. It was great. It was beautiful. It was special. That whole concert is available on our Facebook page. Check it out. And what's so great about Eitan is, you know, it's never just a concert of songs. It's an experience. And our Rav, Yekusiel Kalmanson, told an incredible story. I would tell it now, but it's worth hearing in a little bit longer in detail as he told it. So I would check that out. It's a Kumsitz with Eitan Katz on Accidental Talmudist on our Facebook page. How's everybody doing? Yom Kippur is coming up. We're doing a little learning in these last few days before the Day of Atonement. Who's with us? James in Indianapolis, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Tom says Shalom Havarim, Christo in Lubbock, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehuda in Florence, South Carolina, Francisco in California, Paul in the Great Northwest, Stephen in New Hampshire, David in South Bend, Indiana, Nicholas in Portland, Andy in Virginia, Paula in Chicago, Renee in Michigan, Miriam in Colorado, Bill in Missouri. Shalom from mid-Missouri says, Bill, reminder for everyone, with Yom Kippur approaching, you're probably not hydrating as well as you should be ahead of the fast. Drink more water. Lesson learned the last time I made a major fast. A good lesson. Nina's trick that she's been encouraging our family to do the last few fasts is to drink a whole lot of Gatorade or Smart Water or one of these electrolyte solutions the day before. So not just hydrating, but also hydrating with electrolytes. A good reminder. Francisco loved the Eitan Katz concert last night. John in Maine. Paula loves the beautiful harmony. Carolyn in Raleigh. It skipped on me. Here we go. Heather in Kansas. Pauline in Arkansas. Mary in PA. Welcome, everybody. Over on the YouTube side, Seraphim in Sacramento. Marjorie in Georgia. Ela in Florida. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Catherine Michelson with a simcha. She's sponsoring our learning today in honor of the engagement of our son Baruch Yosef to Melanie DeWeese. Mazel Tov. She wrote Mazel Tov, and here's a hearty Mazel Tov from my heart. May the couple be happy together to 120. May their children grow to Torah, Chuppah, and Masim Tovim. We say Amen. And Catherine, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for sponsoring today's episode and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of AT Daily, just go to accidentaltalmudist.org and follow the donate button. Okay, today's daf, we are on page Yud Gimel, page 13 here in Tractate Beitzah, the 8th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of festivals. We are continuing our discussion of the 8th Mishna in chapter 1. It covers a few different things. Generally, we're looking at the differences between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. What is permitted, what is prohibited on a festival? How does it differ from Shabbos? So yesterday, at the end of the page, we didn't cover, so I'll just read this law that covers what was at the end of yesterday's page. One may husk kernels, right? So this whole idea is you can't thresh on Shabbos. You can neither harvest, you can't cut stuff off living plants because that's the prohibited labor of harvesting on Shabbos, and you can't do that on the festival either. Threshing is separating the edible from the inedible, generally prohibited as well, even though it is clearly part of food preparation for the festive meals of the festival. it doesn't go all the way back to cutting stalks of grain, right? You can't do all the processing. At some point, it's too attenuated from actual meal preparation, and it should have been done before the festival. So you certainly, it's like you can't put grain in under a millstone and grind it into flour. That's just going to be too much, too similar to the work of a weekday to be doing on a festival. But there's a little exception for this. For example, with mustard seeds. So you can't do sort of industrial processing of mustard seeds so that you can get, the spices. Now you can grind like what you're going to need that day to spice your food. I think that's going to be permitted. Can you grind it with a mortar and pestle? That's probably too similar to the work week. Listen to this halacha. It is permitted to husk kernels of grain by hand on a festival. Some authorities maintain that one should be stringent and do so in an unusual manner. The Magen Avraham citing Ron, while others are more lenient, like the Taz and the Vilna Gaon. Where possible, it is preferable to perform this action in an unusual manner. Legumes may be crushed in the usual manner on a festival. One may crush them a little at a time and eat them, even by means of a tray, but not by means of a winnow or a sieve, as the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. Right? So the distinctions that are going to be made are going to be a little bit specific to the kind of food in question. So legumes are going to be distinguished from grains. But the general idea is, okay, if it's something you're going to eat right now and you're going to turn it, from its raw state, its crude state, into something that you can eat right now, it's probably going to be permitted as long as you're not going to get engaged in a process that is too much, like the weekday work, the industrial weekday work, of crushing, milling, winnowing, sorting, the kind of stuff that you'll be doing in large quantities so that you could sell the grain or store the grain. Obviously, that's going to be prohibited on the festival. If it's just the amount that you need for the needs of that day, still, some of it is going to be prohibited as too work-like, and some of it is going to be permitted as what's necessary for food preparation on the festival. So let's get more detailed. So Abaye raises a difficulty against the opinion of Rava that we just read. That is the law, what Rava said, right? So with mustard seeds, kernels of grain, right? You can husk them, not just mustard seed, but kernels of grain if you just do it with your fingers, right? And some say in an unusual manner. So first of all, it doesn't seem like the usual manner to do it with your fingers. This is the kind of work that's done with machines, devices, etc. If you're doing it with your hands, it already seems kind of unusual, but you should go even a little further to acknowledge that, okay, it's preferable not to be doing this at all. We should have done it before the festival. But if we don't do it right now, we're not going to have what to eat. Like maybe something went wrong, like dinner got burned. More people came than you expected. Okay, now we want to rejoice in the festival. We have needs for the meal. Okay, we need some more grain. We're just going to husk it, but with our fingers. Abaye is going to raise a difficulty. But if you say so, that you can husk this grain with your fingers, so we have now found a case of teruma for which its separation is allowed on a festival. Now, what's the issue? Teruma, this means the part of a tithe that you set aside, right? The first teruma, really what we normally call teruma, is for the priests. Only priests can eat it and their families. It must remain in a state of tahara, ritual purity, and the people eating it must be ritually pure. And only the priests and their families can eat it. And then the next tithe is for the Levite. But separating tithes is something that we cannot do on a festival, nor on Shabbos, of course. So what Abaye is saying is, okay, well, if you have unhusked grain, so that grain is not processed, the obligation to separate tithes doesn't kick in until you turn wheat into grain, right? Until it's processed enough that it's like a measurable amount of grain, right? Does it have to become flour? Does it have to be ground into such a fine powder as flour? Clearly not. It's enough that it's husked, right? So at that point, it is processed enough that the obligation to separate teruma kicks in. So if you can take this, this grain that's this wheat that's on the stalk, and now with your fingers, you're going to remove the grain from the husks so you can eat it. So at that point, since it's edible, it's clearly been processed enough that you also have an obligation to separate teruma from it, or you can't eat it. You can't eat untithed grain. So what do we do? Because you can't separate teruma on a festival, but you just, with your fingers in this unusual manner, turn, wheat into grain during the festival so you could eat it. What about the teruma that you have to separate from it so that you can eat it? Is it that you're going to retroactively designate the teruma after the festival? They don't actually bring up that point, at least not yet. So let's hear what Abaye has to say. Before being rubbed, the grains of wheat were certainly not fit to be eaten, and therefore there was no obligation to separate teruma from them. Now that one has prepared them as food by rubbing them, he is obligated to separate teruma from them, and if one is permitted to eat them, he must be permitted to separate teruma from them first. And we learned explicitly in the Mishna, no. If you said that you derive the law from teruma, where its separation is not allowed on the festival. This statement indicates that even Beis Hillel agree. Right? Beis Hillel is the more lenient position on most of these questions that we've encountered. But even Beis Hillel agree that one may not separate teruma of any kind on a festival. So how can we render the wheat into grain so that it's now going to be edible? And we're going to do that on the festival. We're not in an industrial way, but with our hands. But now that it's edible, you have to separate teruma before you can eat it, and you can't separate teruma on the festival. What do? The Gemara refutes this challenge. La Kasha. That's the title of today's show. This is not difficult. You made the question sound more complicated and more challenging than it really is, says the Gemara. La Kasha. This is not difficult. This source, the Beitzah, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, who holds that one must separate teruma from kernels of grain on the stalk, and one may separate terumas on a festival. So Rebbe allows you to separate teruma on the festival so you could deal with this situation. That source, the Mishna, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, who maintains that there is no need to separate teruma from kernels of grain on the stalk, as it is taught in a Beitzah. If one brought inside his house stalks of grain in order to grind them into flour and make dough from them, he may eat from them as a snack before they are ground, and he is exempt from teruma. This is in the same way that you could be walking in a vineyard, right? You don't normally, if you're talking about grapes in a vineyard, those grapes are being grown for what? To make wine. When do you separate the teruma of wine? When it's wine, not when it's grapes. So if you just casually pick some grapes off the vine to eat, you don't have to separate teruma from those. That obligation won't kick in until we're further down the line of that processing and we've made wine. Likewise here, okay, you brought some stalks of wheat into the house. Eventually that wheat is going to get turned into flour so you can make dough, so you can make bread, etc. You didn't do that before the festival. You're not going to do that on the festival. You want to husk some of that wheat so that you can have these kernels of grain which are not going to become flour so quick. You want to eat them in that state. So the obligation of teruma hasn't kicked in yet. It's more of a snack, not a meal. Provided that the grain has not yet been fully processed, the obligation to separate teruma does not apply. And the sages decreed that such produce may only be consumed casually and not as part of a regular meal. However, if from the outset one brought in the stalks of grain, not to grind them, but to husk the kernels and eat them a little at a time, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi does obligate him to separate teruma from them and prohibits them from partaking of the grain until he has done so. Right? So Rabbi Yossi said, if you're going to eat it casually, you're not obligated in teruma to separate the teruma. Rebbe said, you are obligated to separate the teruma, and at least that kind of teruma you can separate even on the festival. It's not going to be like the normal separation of teruma that you would do with a larger scale operation and more processed food, etc. And Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, exempts him from the obligation of teruma. He maintains that not even this intention renders one obligated to separate teruma, as the obligation for teruma applies only to fully processed grain. So Rabbi Yossi says you don't have to separate the teruma. Rebbe says even at this intermediate stage, you do have to separate the teruma, and you can do it on a festival. So in either case, you can rejoice in the festival. Now, the Gemara challenges this whole approach. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, you can also find a case when one must separate teruma from grain that has not been fully processed. How so? For example, if one brought inside his house stalks of grain to make dough from them, thereby rendering himself obligated to separate teruma from them, and he reconsidered, and he decided to husk them in order to eat the kernels on the festival. In that case, the prohibition of untithed produce takes effect on that day, and one is obligated to separate teruma. Only afterward is he permitted to eat the kernels. So you did the same thing. At the end of the day, you brought stalks inside, and then you rubbed them with your fingers and separated the kernels from the husk, and then you wanted to eat the raw kernels, not grind them into flour and bake them into bread. But in one case, you don't have to separate teruma. In the other case, you do, even according to Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. And what is the difference? Your intent when you brought the stalks of grain into your house. If you were intending to make flour and bread and dough and bread out of them, then you're going to have to separate the teruma. If you were intending to just eat them casually as kernels of wheat, then you don't have to separate the teruma. So one must say, what is the teruma that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree may not be separated on a festival? This is referring to most teruma. For example, grain that has been threshed and gathered into piles on the eve of the festival. They do, however, admit that there are exceptional cases in which one may separate teruma on a festival. Right? The normal thing is that you would have had, you're a farmer, you have a bunch of wheat, you have a festival coming up. All right, we want to bake fresh bread during the festival. Yeah, so let's make sure that we have enough wheat that's already been threshed, husked, ground into flour, and we're ready to knead it into dough and bake it on the festival, which is permitted for sure on the festival. We don't want to be engaged in grinding into flour on the festival like that. We waited too long if we're doing that. But in exceptional cases, what are we going to do? Well, maybe we can't grind into flour. Maybe it's too late for that. But okay, I guess we could eat, some kind of raw grain. Has anyone here eaten raw wheat? Like it's just been threshed and husked and eat it that way? Is that good? Like, what's that like? Tell us about it. Okay. Abaye said, this dispute concerning when the obligation to separate teruma and the prohibition of untithed produce takes effect is referring only to stalks of grain, which are typically brought into a granary where they are processed in a standard manner. Until that point, the grain is not prohibited as untithed produce. However, now let's talk about legumes. Everyone agrees that the bundles that are already regarded as that bundles are already regarded as untithed produce, and teruma must be separated from them at that stage, right? Because legumes, we're accustomed to, they require less processing. So as soon as they're harvested and gathered into bundles, they ought to be tithed. The teruma should be separated from them because we don't have to do very much. We could just maybe shake them, get the legumes off the branch, throw them in a pot, and cook them. We don't need so many steps of processing like we do with wheat. So as soon as the legumes are gathered into bundles, the obligation to separate teruma kicks in. That's something you should have done before the festival. So, for example, bundles of fenugreek of untithed produce. If, this is the law, if one separates the first tithe while the produce is still stalks of grain, before one could separate teruma, no, that's a different question. I'm not going to get into that now. Okay, let's just keep going. All right, some say that Abaye said the following. This dispute between Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is referring to stalks of grain. However, with regard to legumes, everyone agrees that bundles are not yet ready to be tithed and are therefore not prohibited as untithed produce. It's just the opposite of what Abaye just said in the first version of Abaye's comment on the dispute between Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rebbe. So now, according to this version, Abaye is saying, well, everyone agrees that bundles of legumes are not thought of as untithed produce and can't be eaten until the tithe is separated. The Gemara raises an objection to this. With regard to one who had bundles of fenugreek, of untithed produce, he may pound them and calculate how many seeds they contain and separate teruma based on the quantity of seeds. But it does not separate based on the quantity of stalks. Now, that's a different law in terms of how you calculate how much teruma is needed. The reason this law is being brought up now is to say, well, these bundles of fenugreek need to be tithed, right? A portion of it needs to be separated. How do you measure how much needs to be separated? That's what they're talking about in that other law. But this indicates that bundles of fenugreek, which is like legumes, or is a legume, I'm not sure, do need to be tithed, right? So this second version of Abaye's commentary on the earlier dispute seems to directly contradict this other law that bundles of fenugreek, like bundles of legumes, need to be tithed. What, is this not referring to the normal case of untithed produce of teruma, i.e. produce from which the regular teruma, the initial portion taken from produce, as the priest's portion, must be separated, right? And the Gemara rejects this. No, it is referring to a different case, that of the first tithe, that is still regarded as untithed produce because the teruma of the tithe that must still be separated from it. Okay, when you're a farmer in the normal situation, you have piles of grain, right? And so you've processed your wheat that you harvested from the field, and you get to the point, right, where you're threshing, winnowing, all the sorting, and you've got piles of grain. Okay, at that point, it needs to be tithed before you go any further. What are the tithes that come out of it? First, for the priests, approximately 1/50th or 2%. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Then 10%, the main tithe, that goes to the Levites. And then the next 10%, or 10% of the remaining 90%, so it's really like 9%, that is the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni, which in most years you use for your needs when you go up to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival. And in 2 of the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle goes to the poor, okay? But that first tithe, not the Teruma Gedola, the 2% that goes to the priest, but that first 10% that goes to the Levites, right, who were not given land, the one tribe not given land, so they receive tithes from the other tribes. When the Levites receive that tithe, they themselves must tithe what they receive and give to the priests. So when they receive their portion, the first tithe, they cannot consume it until they separate the tithe of the tithe, as it were, and give that to the priests. So it is still considered untithed produce vis-a-vis the Levites. And that is what's being referred to in this law that's now being cited for a different reason. And this statement is in accordance with the opinion that Rabbi Abahu said, that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, as Rabbi Abahu said, that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, it can occur that a Levite might take the first tithe before the teruma is separated, while the grain is still on the stalks. So, before the farmer separated 2% for the priests, a Levite came along and said, listen, you know what? I'm in town now. I'm not going to be in town next week when this is fully processed. for your convenience and mine, give me the tithe for the Levite now. Give me the 10% now. And then it's more convenient for both of us. And he's taking it before the Teruma Gedola, before the priest's 2%, which comes off the top. Now that shouldn't be done, but they did it. And it shouldn't be done until the wheat is totally processed into piles of grain. But he's in town now while, the stalks of wheat have been cut down from the field, but they haven't been turned into piles of grain yet. So he said, listen, just give me 10% of what you've cut down. I'll deal with threshing, winnowing, etc. It'll actually save you some work, and we'll help each other out that way. So what happens in that situation? It can occur that a Levite might take the first tithe before the teruma for the priest is separated, and while the grain is still on the stalks. Now, the correct procedure is, after collecting the grain in a pile in the granary, one first separates teruma for the priest, and only afterwards separates first tithe to give to the Levites. If this order was not followed, then the first tithe was separated first, while the grain was still attached to the stalks. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish maintains that the following law applies. Its name, i.e. the fact that it has been designated first tithe, the tithe for the Levites, it's called the first tithe. It's actually taken after the teruma for the priest, but it's called the first tithe in the Torah. So its name, the fact that it has been designated first tithe, renders it ready to be tithed and therefore prohibited as untithed produce, as pertains to teruma of the tithe that must still be separated from it. In other words, this might render the rest of the farmer's produce tithed, right? The Levite came along and said, give me my tithe first before you separate for the priest. That's going to render that produce tithed vis-a-vis the farmer. But vis-a-vis the Levite, who takes his 10% of the farmer's produce, he still has to separate his own 10% to give to the to the priest, right? So it is not ready. What the Levite took is not ready to be consumed by the Levite. It is untithed produce as far as the Levite is concerned. Now, this shows that there can be a separation of a type of teruma, specifically the teruma of the tithe, right, the Levite's portion that he must give to the priest, even before work on the produce has been completed. And this is the case to which the previously quoted Mishna is referring. Remember that the question we're going back to is, does the obligation to separate teruma kick in before the grain is fully processed? Well, when the Levite takes those stalks before they're fully processed into grain, he sort of interrupted the process and took his stuff early. And because he did that, now an obligation to separate teruma does kick in, even at the grain on stalks stage, or the wheat on stalks stage, for the Levite. Now, the Gemara challenges this interpretation. If first tithe is considered, the Levite's portion, is considered untithed produce when it is named, why do I need the act of pounding? Let the Levite say to the priest, well, as they gave me stalks of grain or unprepared bundles, so I am giving them to you in the same state. And Rava said, no, it is a penalty. In other words, the Levite should indeed be entitled to issue this claim. However, as he acted improperly by taking his tithe prematurely, the sages decreed that he may not separate the priest's portion in the current state, but first must improve it, right? So he's going to have to do the work of turning it into grain, that's pounded, etc., and is proper grain in piles, and then he's going to take that 10% and give his tithe to the priest. And the Gemara comments, that opinion is also taught in a Beitzah with regard to a Levite who was given stalks of grain as his tithes. He renders them into a granary, i.e. he must thresh and process them in the usual manner. And similarly, if he was given grapes, he renders them wine. He first has to turn them into wine. And if he was given olives, he renders them into oil. And only afterward, he separates teruma of the tithe for them and gives them to a priest, right? Because why should the priest get shafted just because the Levite was hasty. Normally, the priest would only be receiving processed oil or wine or grain that like ready to be flour. And the fact that the Levite came along and said, you know what, I'll just take the grain while it's still in the stalks stage, and now that I've got my portion, I'll take the 10% I owe the priest, and here, take it on the stalks. No, you have to do the work of processing that, and so that the priest ends up with what he would have ended up with in the first place, which was properly processed produce. Yeah. And the Gemara comments, for just as Teruma Gedola, i.e. the original Teruma from the farmer that's given to the priest, is not separated from unprocessed produce, but only from the granary and the winepress, so too, Teruma of the tithe, meaning the Levite's tithe that he gives to the priest, also is separated from the granary and the winepress. Now, we're at the top of the B side of 13. The Gemara asks, if the Mishnah is referring to produce from which Teruma Gedola has not been separated, it is appropriate to use the term calculates. However, according to the suggestion that it is referring to a first tithe from which Teruma of the tithe must be separated, why does the Mishnah use this word calculates? The Tana of the Mishnah should have said measures. The amount of Teruma Gedola to be separated is calculated by estimation, as there is no fixed amount for this Teruma according to Torah law. With regard to the Teruma separated from the first tithe, however, the Torah established the fixed amount of 1/10, and one is required to measure precisely. So this is very interesting. When the Levite receives the tithe from the farmer, he receives 1/10 of the farmer's produce, and then he must set aside 1/10 of what he receives and give that to the priest. But regarding that original 2% that the farmer gives to the priest directly, right? The priest gets it in two ways, right? He gets 2% of the whole pile from the farmer, and he gets 10% of the 10% from the Levite, right? So it's like he gets 3% altogether. 2% from the farmer and 1% of the whole original pile from the Levite. But whereas the 10% of the 10% is measured by volume or weight or however it's going to be done, that original 2% from the farmer is not measured. It's actually not measured. It's estimated, and it has to be estimated. The law, Teruma Gedola, the original portion set aside from the priest, one may not separate Teruma Gedola by measurement, weight, or number. Rather, one must estimate the size of the portion he wishes to give and separate it. This is such a strange law. You would think, okay, we want you to be meticulous and make sure that you set aside what is due to the Cohen from your produce, Mr. Farmer. But in fact, you should be meticulous and make sure you do it, but not by weight or measure or volume. It has to be done by an estimation in your mind. Some commentaries explain that this phrase is actually a single expression, meaning one may make an estimate by calculating. Others, however, claim that there is a distinction between the two. By estimation means without precise measurement, whereas by thought is referring to the law that one does not have to separate the portion in practice, as it is sufficient if one makes an internal decision that a certain portion is considered teruma. Let me finish. And the Rambam rules in accordance with the opinion of Abba Elazar ben Gimel that this is not merely an option, but a mitzvah, a commandment. One must estimate, not make an exact calculation. Other commentaries claim that the same applies to teruma of the tithe, even what the Levite sets aside from the priest. Although the Torah established a fixed amount for this gift, it is the donor's obligation to ensure that his estimation is not less than the required amount, as he is held responsible if he failed to take sufficient care in this regard. With respect to the Teruma Gedola, the reason we've said approximately 2% is because what the Torah actually stipulates is that you set aside some for the priest initially, off the top. How much? And then the sages derived that if you want to give a generous portion to the priests, you give 1/40, right? That's like 2.5%. If you want to give the average amount, 1/50th, 2%. If you want to be miserly, 1/60th. What is that? 1.6%. Isn't that interesting, right? And it's like, and any amount it will satisfy your Torah obligation, but by rabbinic decree, it has to be more in line with either 1/40th or 1/50th, even 1/60th if you're going to be miserly. But all of that it has to be done by estimation, not by measurement. And the Gemara explains, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Abba Elazar ben Gimel, as it is taught in a Beitzah. Abba Elazar ben Gimel says, the verse states, Numbers 18:27, and your teruma shall be reckoned to you as though it were the corn of the granary and as the fullness of the winepress. And the verse speaks of two terumas. One is teruma gedola, the initial teruma from the farmer to the priest. And the other one is teruma of the tithe, the portion that the Levite sets aside from the tithes he received and then gives to the priest. Two terumas. And just as teruma gedola is separated by estimation and is not measured exactly, and it is enough to separate it by thought, as the word reckoned implies that the mere intention to separate a particular portion serves to remove the rest of the produce from its untithed state, so too, teruma of the tithe can also be separated by estimation and by thought. We skip a little. It's getting late, so we're getting near the end. If you have questions or comments, get them in now. We learned in a Mishna there in Ma'asrot. So that's a collection of Mishnayos. It's a Mishna, one of the books of Mishna, but it does not have Gemara commentary on it. So it's not one of the books of the Talmud that we'll be reading in the Daf Yomi cycle. But in the book of Mishna called Ma'asrot, 4:5, one who peels grains of barley to eat them raw may peel them one by one and eat them immediately without tithing them, as this is considered a casual manner of eating. But if he peeled and placed several of them into his hand, well, then he is obligated to separate tithe. Rabbi Elazar said, and a similar law applies on Shabbos. Peeling grains of barley one by one is not considered threshing, and so it's permitted. If a whole handful of grains are peeled together, this does constitute the prohibited labor of threshing, right? So at what point are you, is what you're doing, you're just eating a little bit of barley, raw barley by hand, you can eat it. Okay, you can even do that on Shabbos. If you take a bunch of barley and start separating what you're going to eat, now you're threshing, you're separating, you're sorting, prohibited. And the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rav's wife peel for him barley on Shabbos by the cupful? And likewise, Rav Chia's wife would peel barley for him on Shabbos by the cupful. Rather, if Rabbi Elazar's comment was stated in this context, it was stated with regard to the latter clause of that same Mishnah. With regard to one who husks kernels of wheat by hand, he may blow onto the chaff to disperse it a little at a time and eat the kernels without separating tithes. But if he blows on the kernels and puts a large amount of them into his lap, then he is obligated to separate tithes from the food. It was with regard to this teaching that Rabbi Elazar said, and a similar law applies to Shabbos. Rabbi Abba Bar Memel strongly objects to this. And with regard to the first clause of the Mishnah, one should conclude, yes, if one peeled a handful of barley, it is considered prepared with regard to tithes. But no, it is not considered threshing with regard to Shabbat. But is there anything that with regard to Shabbos is not considered the completion of the labor and it may be performed, and yet with regard to tithes, it is considered the completion of labor, right? How could it be that you've done a procedure, separating this barley from its husks, and it's going to be permitted on Shabbos because you're not threshing, and yet it's not going to be considered that you threshed in terms of obligating you in tithes? Like, the law of Shabbos is more stringent than the law of tithes, so how can this be? And Rav Sheshes, the son of Rav Edi, strongly objects to this claim. And is there no example of a law in which tithes are treated more stringently than Shabbos? Sure, that can happen. Don't worry about it. And is there not the law of their granary for tithes, as we learned in a Mishna at Masrot 1.5? What is the equivalent of their granary, i.e. the point at which the processing of various vegetables is completed so that they become obligated in tithes? Well, with regard to cucumbers and gourds, they become obligated from when one trims the thin hairs that cover them. And for those he did not trim, from when he assembles them in a pile. And we also learned in a Mishnah, Masrot 1.6, with regard to onions, that it is from when one assembles them in a pile. Whereas, with regard to Shabbos, one who assembles produce in a pile is exempt, as this is not a prohibited labor on Shabbos. So it can be that you could take your onions that are in the kitchen and make a pile out of them, and then you become obligated to separate tithes, but you didn't violate Shabbos by making a pile of onions. Rather, what have you to say? Why is one exempt if he forms a pile on Shabbos? The Torah prohibited only planned, constructive labor on Shabbos, the type of work that involves the creation of something new. And the formation of a pile is not considered that kind of labor. Here too, with regard to peeling barley, the Torah prohibited creative work, and although collecting the peeled barley in one's hand is considered the completion of the labor with respect to tithes, it is not prohibited labor on Shabbos. That's what we've got today. Let's go to comments and questions. Okay, Sharon, we only have one question. Don't they eat parched grain with vinegar? In the book of Ruth. Parched grain with vinegar. Sounds right. Now, maybe when you talk about parched grain with vinegar, it's actually the simple name of a more complex dish, right? I mean, I'm not sure. But that book, the book of Ruth, right, is all about harvest time. So, I mean, I don't think they were talking about tithes, but it's interesting, like what lessons the sages would learn out from that. Maybe that'll come up in the upcoming pages. Because like they're surrounded by the produce that they just picked. Maybe like while it's still fresh, there's something that's good about it that you could eat, and you'd want to eat that. And can you eat it even though you're not separating tithes? Maybe that's casual eating and not really a meal, right? And that seems to be part of the distinction that they're mentioning here. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, at 6 p.m. Pacific, the normal time, for page 14. And then Yom Kippur is Wednesday night, right? Double checking the calendar. Yeah, Yom Kippur starts Wednesday night. So for sure, going to be no class Wednesday. We could have a class Motzi Yom Kippur. I'm just going to say no. It's not going to happen. All right. So what we'll do is we'll have a makeup class on Friday at noon. That'll be a 3-page class to cover Wednesday when we're preparing for Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur starts, and then Thursday when we come out of Yom Kippur, beaten and battered, but ecstatic because of the beautiful davening that we'll have done in Shul. But we won't be in a mood to learn that night. It will just be too spent. So that's the schedule. We'll have class tomorrow, Tuesday, and then the next one will be on Friday at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a great night.